The little 1960 to 1969 Corvair, a very innovative compact car from General Motors that was engineered by Ed Cole and had many interesting features. Today, we're not going to do a full talk about the Corvair and its many variants, everything from the two-door Corvair to the four-door to the convertible to the ramp-side pickup to the Greenbrier minivan and everything in between. Oh, of course, the Corvair wagon as well, the Lakewood wagon. Many different variants of the Corvair were clearly produced over the years in two generations. The first generation lasting from 1960 to 1964 model years, and then the second generation, which is my personal favorite, from the 1965 to 1969 model years. The Corvairs, when they came out in 1960, really were responding to a desire of the American public for more economy-focused vehicles. Remember, this was a time frame when the U.S. economy was recovering from the late 1950s recession, and customers were pretty conscious about the operating costs of their vehicles. And so the Corvair really fit the bill in terms of being space efficient, and it really was an interesting kind of value proposition for an American car. Of course, there had been other vehicles that were rear-engined with air-cooled engines, and the Corvair had its rear-engine, air-cooled, six-cylinder engine out back, and that afforded a number of benefits. One, there was more room up front with a flatter floor than a typical vehicle because, well, there was no engine and then a drive shaft that had to go to the rear wheels. On top of that, there was better traction because the rear wheels had the engine over top of them. There was no coolant or radiator to really worry about since the engine was air-cooled. The Corvair also really didn't need power steering since the engine was in the back, and that's where most of the weight was, so you didn't need power steering to be able to turn the wheel with relative ease. And it had a pretty good suspension setup. The swing axle out back was something that Ralph Nader would certainly not be a fan of, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But it did have four-wheel independent suspension, and that was something that was considerably different than other vehicles of the time that had often solid axles out back. So the little Corvair had so many innovative features, and it really kicked off a new generation of compact cars from General Motors. The Corvair would be introduced for 1960. And then for 1961, you had the other so-called senior compacts that were a little bit bigger than the Corvair, the Pontiac Tempest, the Olds F85, and the Buick Special. Now, these vehicles would be relatively popular upon introduction, but as the economy gained steam in the 1960s, and as fuel prices really remained, I'll say, stable, the desire for the American buying public to drive a smaller vehicle just really waned. And one thing that you have to know if you don't live in the United States about the American buying public is that so long as gas prices are cheap, they will buy the largest possible vehicles that they can, even if they're just hauling around one person. So that's why everybody's driving a pickup truck or an SUV, a big SUV in the United States more often than not. And back in the day, before the SUV craze really hit, people just drove bigger and bigger cars. So the vehicles that I mentioned would either go away, like the Corvair did after the 1969 model year, or in the case of the Pontiac Tempest as an example, it just ended up getting bigger. So it was this interesting moment in time where the desires of the American public really matched up with what the product planners had come up with at General Motors. Now, the Corvair was the brainchild of Ed Cole, who would later ascend to the GM presidency. Cole was a highly talented engineer who worked on a number of innovative vehicles like the Corvair, but also was known as the father of the Chevrolet small block V8. Now, one thing about Ed Cole was that he was allegedly quite headstrong, and if somebody went up against him, well, it was pretty tough to fight against him. He was also the father of the Vega, and the Vega was, let's say, a car with myriad flaws, including its aluminum block four-cylinder engine, which again was Ed Cole's idea that he really pushed through. And that was unfortunate. The car had a number of shortcomings. The Vega was a great-looking vehicle, but the engine was really the Achilles heel of that car. And again, while Ed Cole was the father of the Chevrolet small block, one of the most successful, if not the most successful engine in modern history, He also was the father of the Chevrolet Vega four-cylinder. Nonetheless, I digress. Let's get back to the Corvair and some interesting facts that I wanted to share with you that you may not know about the car. Now, the first thing that I mentioned is that the Corvair had a swing axle rear suspension in its early years, particularly the first generation, 1960 to 1964. And a swing axle is effectively a type of independent suspension where the pivot point is at the center of the vehicle. Here, as you can see on the top picture, at the rear differential for the Corvair. And notice that in the diagram it says the 1960 to 1963 swing axle design. Now, the Corvair was certainly something that was criticized for this particular rear suspension design by Ralph Nader, who said that, as you notice, the camber changes on that right wheel as it moves up and down in an arc, and obviously the same is true for the left wheel. But Ralph Nader alleged that that made the car unsafe, despite the fact that the Beetle for many years, I think up until the late 1960s, employed the same swing axle type design. Numerous Porsches did. It was kind of a cost-effective independent rear suspension. But as I mentioned, the trade-off is that the wheel is kind of sweeping in an arc as the car goes up and down. So it was alleged that this gave the car a tendency to oversteer at higher speeds, and particularly with overinflated tires. And many people know this about the Corvair, swing axle rear suspension, and of course the book Unsafe at Any Speed. But what most people don't know is in the last year of the first model of the Corvair, 1964, there actually was a leaf spring, just one leaf on either side. You can see it in the bottom picture. And that was employed to help with the camber compensation to rid the car of that particular issue, or at least, I shouldn't say rid it, but mitigate that particular issue. And it did work pretty effectively. So many people don't know that is a 1964 Corvair only trait. That suspension with that leaf setup in combination with the swing axle was only employed for that model year. By 1965, the Corvair would adopt a suspension similar to the Corvette, an independent rear suspension with U-joints at both ends, as opposed to just at the center end near the differential. And of course, then that kind of got rid of this issue altogether. But I always thought that it was fascinating that Chevrolet for 1 year had employed these leaf springs as camber compensators. And here you can actually see it from the underside. You can see the leafs running on the underside of the Corvair to help attenuate that camber issue that these cars were kind of known for. It also, aside from just helping keep the camber in line, it helped the wheel look, I'll say, a little less funny when you were going around a corner, because you can imagine if you're going around a corner pretty fast, it could look a little strange to see the wheel tucking in on the one side and tucking under on the other with the swing axle design. Now on to the Corvair's flat air-cooled six-cylinder engine. This was General Motors' first flat air-cooled six-cylinder engine, and when it debuted in the Corvair in 1960, it was 140 cubic inches. It was enlarged to about 145 cubic inches for the 1961 to 1963 model years, and then it was enlarged again in 1964. More specifically, from 1964 to 1969, the engine would displace 164 cubic inches. Overall, you could get Corvair engines in anything from 80 horsepower at the low end to 180 horsepower in terms of turbocharged variants at the high end. There were many differences along the way. For example, in 1960, you got an engine that I mentioned was 140 cubic inches. It had two carburetors that shared a common intake, and the car had an automatic choke setup. In 1961, they got rid of, for whatever reason, the automatic choke setup, and it had a manual choke. You had to pull a knob out, and it would activate the manual chokes on the two carburetors. Then for 1963, it would go back to an automatic choke on the dual carburetors. And there were two carburetor variants, there were four carburetor variants, there were turbocharged, naturally aspirated Corvair engines, just a whole host of different types. In 1962, the Corvair would get its first turbocharged variant of the engine, the 145 cubic incher by this point, and it would make 150 horsepower. It would take until 1965 for that turbocharged engine to be enlarged and also for the power output to grow to 180 horsepower. And by that point, there was also a 4-carburetor variant of the engine. Now, one thing that many people don't know is that as time went on, the Corvair kind of became increasingly deluxe and luxurious of an offering. And commensurate with that, air conditioning actually became an option partway through the 1961 model year. Now, air conditioning on an air-cooled car, this is pretty interesting. And take a look at this particular picture of how General Motors executed the air conditioning setup. Clearly, you've got the GM A6 style air conditioning compressor there in the photo, but they mounted the condenser right on top of the engine fan. And I guess the thought here was that the engine fan would suck in the air and kind of suck it in through the condenser and then into the engine to cool it. Now, somehow this was validated, I guess, at GM's desert proving grounds out in Mesa, Arizona. But I have to imagine the engine compartment would get extremely hot because the condenser would get hot. The engine fan not only had to cool the engine in these cases with the air conditioning running, but also had to basically move air over the condenser fins for the air conditioning to work effectively. So if you've never seen a Corvette with air conditioning, that's what it looks like. Now, in 1966, they changed the style of the air conditioning condenser, and as opposed to being mounted right over top of the engine, it was actually mounted kind of in front of the engine closer to the passenger compartment. And the idea there was that there were inlet vents in the tulip panel of the Corvair. And because the engine fan was sucking in air to blow over the engine, it created a vacuum in the engine compartment, and therefore the air would have to come in through those vents, blow over the condenser, and then it could go into the engine area. This allowed General Motors to go back to kind of a more conventional style air cleaner assembly for the Corvairs. And I guess it proved effective so long as all the sealing worked, because this really depended on having that vacuum within the engine compartment in order for the air conditioning to work. Now, another fact that many don't know about the engines on these cars is that they're actually, beginning in 1963, there was an option, kind of a desert engine option, for an oil bath air cleaner to help provide clean air to the engine. In those early years, as you see kind of here, a standard Corvair with 2 carburetors, one on either side with the common air intake in the middle, nothing really all that special about it. You got the one air intake feeding both carburetors. But take a look here at this photo, and you can see that there were Corvairs that with that particular option, they had an oil bath air cleaner in the middle, and then the air would have to pass through that oil bath air cleaner to go to either carburetor in the event that the desert engine option was selected. Now, interestingly as well, when air conditioning was introduced on the Corvair, and in some of the model years, it appears that General Motors intended to make a variant of that kind of desert air cleaner setup standard with the air conditioning, because there were some option list pricing sheets that included that air cleaner along with air conditioning. And the thought was, as you can see from the photo here, that when you got that desert engine option and the air cleaner, it was positioned off to the side, so presumably it kind of helped with cold air intake into the engine, so that the engine could also, let's say, get maybe a little bit less warm air than it otherwise would. But that was something that, for whatever reason, the engineers just decided to forego in the end. But many people don't know that you could get that desert engine option and these funky air cleaners and setups, not just on the Corvair cars, but also on the Ramside pickup and the Greenbrier. And those are collector's pieces and very, very rare indeed. Another piece of interesting trivia with respect to these Corvairs is that the convertible variants had cocktail shakers that came standard in them. The cocktail shaker, you say, in conjunction with a car that you can drive, that does not sound like a good idea. And of course, that would not be. But I'm referring to a different type of cocktail shaker, more specifically, a vibration dampener. Now, these were placed in the corners of the Corvair convertibles. You also found them in other General Motors cars, like some Camaro convertibles. And the purpose was that they would help reduce vibrations and kind of quell what was otherwise a little bit of a flexible chassis from vibrating too much. They're relatively heavy. They're oil-filled with weights, and I suppose they work. because a lot of people still have them in their Corvair to attenuate the various vibrations that would be caused by driving the car, in particular down bumpy roads. But most people don't know what these cylinders are that are in their Corvair. It just looks like some round barrel, and they're affectionately known, as I said, as cocktail shakers. And the last fun facts for the day on the Corvair will be related to its design. Now, the individual that was in charge of the Chevrolet studio that was designing the Corvair was Ned Nichols. And Ned Nichols actually was an individual who designed Buicks for years, and some say he was even responsible for putting portholes on Buicks. Ned Nichols was also the individual who contributed significantly to the design of the first generation Riviera. But Nichols contributed a lot to the Corvair as well, and apparently one of the things that General Motors did during this time frame in order to disguise the fact that it was working on its own compact car was to tell designers that they were actually working on a Holden, or a car for General Motors Australia. Now, this would have been pretty standard fare for the time. A lot of the overseas cars were designed in the Michigan area and in the studios at the General Motors Tech Center. So designers probably didn't think anything of it. But in reality, that was just kind of a way to disguise the fact that GM was looking to bring out its own compact car. Now, the designers actually had to model two different designs for the Corvair. One was fashioned after what Ed Cole wanted, and the other after what General Motors Design Vice President Harley Earl wanted. And apparently from various accounts of designers, the final variant of the Corvair really resembled something more akin to what Ed Cole wanted versus Mr. Earl. But regardless, the designers of the Corvair certainly had a storied history. And I thought it was interesting that Ned Nichols in particular had some significant ties to Buick and had executed quite a few famous Buicks during his time at General Motors. So what do you think about these cool facts about the Corvair? What are some others? And what other cars would you like to learn cool facts about? Put a comment in the comment section. Thanks again for watching.